evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. For those of you who have been through the trouble of getting here today, we thank you, and we thank everyone joining us from to the live broadcast. So we'd like to welcome you to the year-end event of the Israeli Forum for Intelligence Studies, also known as IFIS. My name is Prof, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Chaikin Chair for Geostrategy at Haifa University and the coordinator of IFIS. Most of you probably hear about IFIS for the first time, and for the first time when we sent out the invitation for this event, and that is perfectly fine because at the beginning of this academic year in October 2022, IFIS was only an idea, and a pretty good idea, if I may say so. And the credit for the idea of establishing an academic forum, sort of an association that brings together scholars of intelligence, goes to the Institute for the Research of the Methodology of Intelligence, which is affiliated with the Israeli Intelligence Heritage Center, hosting us this evening. So before we dive into our very rich program that we have for you today, I would like to invite the head of the Institute for the Research of the Methodology of Intelligence and the former head of the Research and Analysis Division in the Military Intelligence Directorate, Amman, Brigadier General in Reserve, Yossi Kupavaso, to say a few things.
Good afternoon. It's going to be less than a few things. It's going to be very brief. But first of all, I'm very happy to see you all here. And especially thrilled that most of the participants in this meeting are young. So there's a future for intelligence studies. And even the presenters seem to be young. So it's really reason to be optimistic about the future. As Ofek said, this was a part of our wider effort to promote the academization of the intelligence studies in Israel. We were pretty frustrated in the Institute of the lack of intelligence studies in the Israeli academia. And we were very envious at some other places like the United States, Britain, and other places, especially in Europe, that do have intelligence as a profession in the academia. And we thought of various ways of promoting intelligence studies. So we are working in trying to build up studies of intelligence and research of intelligence in the academia. And we have made some progress on those efforts, but they are not still visible, not tangible yet. I hope they are going to be so in the coming academic year or towards the end of this academic year. We do that, we have here Ofer Guterman. Where is he? Here is Ofer Guterman, who is heading this effort in our institute. And we really hope that we shall see some fruits in the coming year. At the same time, we started with what we thought is a preliminary move in this direction, which is to bring all the experts that are interested in intelligence as an academic issue together, all those who deal with that in Israel. And Ofek will share with us in a minute this presentation that also has some numbers about how many people joined. But yes, I know. But I must say that we were very impressed and happy with the readiness of everybody to join in. And we had a very fruitful year, and we have a lot of expectations for the coming year. And I wish that we shall be able to stand here next year with even more achievements of our efforts. The proof is in the taste of the pudding. So that's what we have seen so far was very tasty. I hope it will be even sweeter in the coming year. Let's start this evening, which is very promising. We have a lot of experts on this interesting topic. And I'll let Ofek present the visitors that we have and the presenter. Please.
Thank you. So, as I said earlier, IFIS was only an idea in October of last year, but in a short period of 9 months, we have accomplished a lot. So for those of you who are already members of the forum, and for those of you who would like to become members and join our activities in the coming year, I would like to take 7 minutes just to give you a brief overview of IFIS mission, accomplishments, and plans for the near future. So the mission was, like Kubo said, to advance the academic research of intelligence in Israel by creating this platform for knowledge sharing and collaboration among senior and junior scholars, both within Israel and abroad, and today is just an example of what we want to do. So in this period of 9 months, over this period we had over 80 registered members. Unfortunately, only 14 women, and this is something that the field, at least in Israel, is still missing. But I'm happy to say that over 60% or so are from our scholars from the Israeli academia, and as you can see, a fifth of them are graduate students. And we have put here a QR code in the outside, so you can join us if you'd like to be part of our future activities. We had, on average, 1 session per month, so we had overall 10 sessions this year, and I'm happy to say that 6 of them were in person, and only 4 were virtual. We had about an average of about 22 participants for a session, which is quite nice for what is an academic seminar in the end. We've covered a range of topics. So we started with Professor Josh Rovner's lecture talk about about intelligence and broader questions of IR and international security. We had Professor Austin Carson here last month to talk about some of the consequences for intelligence infrastructure, global outreach of intelligence infrastructure on great power politics. We talked about intelligence analysis, of course, and intelligence education. We had actually a pretty stimulating roundtable here at the Heritage Center a few months ago. We talked about intelligence in society and then interesting talks about counterintelligence, double agents, moles, etc. And today we will speak about covert action. We also had the privilege of hosting a few leading scholars from outside of Israel, as you can see from the United States, from the UK, from Spain and the Netherlands, and here we had good representation gender-wise. So I think that one of the main accomplishments we can say was to add this intelligence section into the local Association for the Studies for International Studies, the IAIS, and we were able to put together 2 panels specifically dedicated to intelligence, and these were the panels. And we also have, of course, some presence, still modest presence on social media, so you can follow us on Twitter. We just opened a YouTube channel, but we only have one session there, and hopefully we will put this one on YouTube. And looking ahead into the future, we put out a call for papers for a conference that we will hold in October, marking 50 years since the Yom Kippur surprise attack and the intelligence failure. And we will be doing this in Tel Aviv University. We put out, as I said, a call for papers on 4 topics that we have that the organizing committee had decided on. So these are the themes: failure and strategic surprises, emerging technology, and advanced methods in intelligence collection and analysis, intelligence and civilian affairs, so everything that has to do with democracy, ethics, openness, oversight, and these sorts of things, and non-military threats, and also the socio-cultural aspects of intelligence studies, in terms of gender, culture, organizational processes that underlie intelligence work. Looking further ahead to our next year, we would like to cover new topics that we haven't covered this year, such as emerging technology, engage with the literature on business intelligence or competitive intelligence as it's called, and talk more about methodology of intelligence and methodology and methods of intelligence studies. We'd like to broaden our outreach to junior research and BA and MA. And also we would like to do some more international collaborations. So there was an idea to bring also international participants into our sessions and bring them in through either virtually or in the conference that we will hold in October. And there is an idea of institutionalizing IFIS and registering it as an association so that it will have this continuity. So you're welcome to email me. You're welcome to use the QR code outside to register to the forum and to join our sessions next year. And this is all. So now, if there aren't any questions, comments on that, we can proceed to the pinnacle of our event. Okay. So, covert action is an open secret that represents the shadowy side of international relations. Covert action is a vital tool of statecraft. If used judiciously, it can play an important, if facilitative, role in pursuing national interests in a dangerous world. If used insouciantly, it can bring political scandal and diplomatic embarrassment. Worse still, it can result in needless deaths or foment chaos and instability. Covert action is a provocative and risky business, and one which requires careful consideration. These are not my words, these are the words of Professor Cormac in the introduction to one of his previous books from 2018, Disrupt and Deny. The good students we are, we wanted to give careful consideration to this important, pervasive, and very close to home phenomenon. And who's better suited to talk about this subject than Professor Rory Cormac, who we have the pleasure of having here with us today. So I'll briefly present Rory. Rory is a professor of international relations at the University of Nottingham, specializing in secret intelligence and covert action. Professor Cormac has written 6 books, and his university website seems to be having a hard time keeping pace with them. But his most recent one is How to Stage a Coup and 10 Other Lessons from the World of Secret Statecraft. So Professor Cormac is also the director of the Center of the Study of Subversion, Unconventional Intervention, and Terrorism at the University of Nottingham, and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, as well as an associate fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Professor Cormac, the floor is yours.
I really need to update that bit of bio. Where it says Rory Cormac is a specialist in intelligence and covert action, it has to say it's a specialist in the study of intelligence and covert action. It looks very dodgy. I keep meaning to update it, and I always forget. Yes, I just study it rather than practice. Thank you very much, Ofe. Thank you very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. And for the invitation, and to Ofe for his generous hospitality and his impeccable organisational skills in what's a difficult time. Okay, so I am going to talk about covert operations as secret statecraft. And this has been in the news a lot recently. It's almost paradoxically prominent. It's supposed to be covert, and yet we know a lot about things that are going on, and that strikes me as slightly strange. Particularly when we know a lot about things that are supposedly successful. You think we don't know about the ones that have gone wrong, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So they're paradoxically prominent. but they're also still a bit mysterious, even in an age of open source intelligence, an age of Bellingcat. We still don't know everything. Nord Stream pipeline explosion, for example, is a recent example of a great whodunit from the last year. And at the same time, perhaps because of the openness and the mystery, covert action is incredibly mythologized and misunderstood. We tend to see it through the prism of James Bond and Jason Bourne and all sorts of crazy stuff, when the reality, I was going to say, is more mundane, but often the reality is just as crazy as James Bond, but in different ways, and with more lawyers and paperwork and things like that. So the first point that I want to make is that lots of states engage in covert operations. This is a part of statecraft. But let's start with the United States, because the United States dominates our understanding, it dominates the history books when it comes to covert action, because of all of the famous stories from the golden age of covert action in the 1950s, when you've got things like the joint CIA MI6 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, you've got a coup in Guatemala in 1954, and there are some utterly bizarre stories from those years. My favourite one, which as I say is more mundane than James Bond, but get this one. My favourite one, which never, to be fair, never left the CIA drawing room, it was abandoned, was in many ways they wanted to get rid of Fidel Castro in Cuba. We've heard about exploding seashells, we've heard about exploding cigars. I was reading recently about one that they called elimination by illumination. And this was the plan, to create an uprising in Cuba which would overthrow Castro by staging the second coming of Jesus Christ. That was the plan. They were going to fire flares into the sky and propaganda and all sorts. Ridiculous idea, didn't got the drawing board. But this is why this type of statecraft is, I think, so interesting, but also quite mythologized and confusing sometimes. But this is how the United States defines covert action. It is activity or activities of the United States government to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, where it is intended that the role of the United States government will not be apparent or act publicly. That's where we get the obsession with plausible deniability. But I think it's really important to note when we talk about secret statecraft that it's not just the United States. There are so many different states engaging in what the Americans call covert action. Russia, we know, dominating the headlines. If the US dominates the history books, Russia certainly dominates the headlines at the moment. Going back probably to when 2014 and the takeover of Crimea with the little green men, whatever they were called, and then Trump, and then so on and so forth, various assassination attempts. So Russia clearly does a lot of that. But is it the same as what we're talking about with the Americans? China is also increasingly featuring in the headlines for its approach. Just in the news, I think literally this morning, there was a breaking news out of the United States where some think tank leader was a covert political agent, I think, of the Chinese taking secret payments. We know, of course, that Israel has a track record in this world. And when I checked in at the hotel last night, the guy saw Professor in front of my name, and he said, "Why are you here? What are you a professor of?" And I said, "Professor of International Relations." And he said, "Oh, why are you here? We don't do much of that." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Well, what specifically?" And I said, "I'm here for a conference on secret intelligence." And he said, "Oh, we do a lot of that." Israel, of course, has a reputation for a robust approach to some of this type of activity, as does France. He also has a reputation for being quite robust. The UK has been doing this since before Israel existed, since before the United States existed. The UK has been doing this back in the 16th century. And one of my favourite things I read was say from Queen Elizabeth's time, so 1500 something, and they were trying to subvert the King of Spain and his attempt to do something in the Low Countries. And it involved mercenaries, it involved bribery, it involved proxy wars. And one of Queen Elizabeth's advisors said, let's use, and I quote, covert means. But it was spelled in like ye olde English way. You see fake English pubs where they got the extra E in their words. It was spelled covert means, M-E-A-N-E-S. And it's like the same kind of language we're using today. But this was 500 years ago. And of course, India and Pakistan have a long tradition of using covert operations against each other, going back to their very creation. Iran, of course, the Gulf. There are lots and lots of states doing this. This isn't niche activity, I think, is a key point. This is a part of statecraft. So we as scholars need to understand when, why, how, whether it works and the effects it has. Because we can't study diplomacy, we can't study warfare, we can't study international relations without understanding this secret side. It's not just the world of James Bond and the CIA. Lots and lots of states engaged in this. And I was quite struck when I was doing my most recent book to read about Brazilian covert action, for example. We all think about 1973 coup in Chile, and we associate that straight away with the CIA. Of course we do. Brazil was also involved in that, independently of the CIA. Australia was also involved in the 1973 Chilean coup. So lots of states engage in this, and it's important to remember it. But what happens as academics is we understand covert action through the US prism. We understand Israeli covert action, we understand British covert action through this American definition. Pretty much every textbook starts with the US definition and then says that there are other countries that do it a bit. But I think there are some dangers there. There are some problems. The first problem, by focusing on the US definition, is that we tend to overemphasize plausible deniability and international law. Americans, I think, go too far and fetishize plausible deniability as this sacred cow of intelligence studies, and covert action has to be plausibly deniable. And this, I think, if we use that to understand other countries, and indeed some American operations, it raises big questions. For example, we think that the Russians are very good at covert actions. This is the narrative that's built up. It just doesn't translate. A lot of literature also suggests that states engage in covert action in order to bypass international law because they care about international law. And that raises questions about Russia, frankly, seem to care less about international law and the liberal international order. It also overemphasizes, this obsession with the American prism also overemphasizes distinctions between military and civilian, between foreign and domestic, between open and secret. Military, that's special military operations, even though to you and I they look pretty similar, they are distinct things. For America, covert action is about international statecraft. You cannot use covert action domestically. But when we think about secrecy in international relations, when we think about covert operations as statecraft, this starts to fall down as soon as you look away from the US. Even America's closest allies blur the lines, for example, between foreign and domestic. The UK, for example, targets domestic audiences with covert action, to put it bluntly. The troubles in Northern Ireland, the conflict in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s, was on British soil and they engaged in a range of covert action. The blurring of foreign and domestic. What does that tell us about, I don't know, Saudi Arabia's covert killing of the dissident Jamal Khashoggi back in 2018? Where's the line between covert action as secret statecraft and totalitarian states, or non-democratic states, oppressing their own dissidents? Is that the same thing? Russia trying to assassinate Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018. Is that covert action? Is that secret statecraft? Is that part of international relations? Or is that just domestic repression? kind of thing we expect from a police state. Where's the line? How do we understand that as scholars if these definitions aren't properly thought through? And also the third point, the reliance on US PRISM, is we get quite a narrow scope of what covert action involves, which raises questions about things which might fall out of that scope, like Israel's long track record, for example, of covertly facilitating or rescuing Jewish diaspora overseas, bringing back to Israel, the famous operation in Sudan, for example, using the, far more familiar with it than me, using the fake holiday companies to spirit people away across the Red Sea. We need to say, well, what are we talking about? What can we broaden our definitions? And I think a better way of thinking about it is around unacknowledged intervention. I think the obsession with plausible deniability is a bit of a red herring. Another example of that, Operation Cyclone, 1980s Afghanistan, when the Americans famously been made into a film in the Guinness Book of World Records, actually, as the most expensive covert action of all time, when the Americans supplied money and training weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and it's widely regarded as a success. But I remember teaching it a few years ago, and a student saying to me, "It's not covert. How is this covert action? It's not covert." And I said, "Well, plausible deniability." And the student said to me, "It's not remotely plausible." So I think it actually makes more sense to think about this in terms of unacknowledged. And that then gets us into the world of ambiguity as well, where states might, they don't plausibly deny things, they deliberately create a culture of ambiguity around their covert operations. So that's what we're talking about, unacknowledged interventions in statecraft. I think there are three forms of covert action: propaganda, political, and paramilitary. Getting more controversial as we move up, and more sensitive as we move up the ladder of escalation, to use a phrase from Locke Johnson. The first one, of course, is propaganda. And I was reading recently about this post-truth era, when facts were interpreted through ideological prisms. I was reading about when facts were interpreted through one's own personal truths, a time when conspiracy was rife, and a time when new technology was fanning all sorts of wild rumours about papal plots and things against the Stuart dynasty. And I think it's really important to remember that none of this is new that we're talking about here. Propaganda is as old as time, and loads of states do it. The majority of states doing unattributable or covert propaganda do it against their own citizens. But there are about, according to recent calculations, is new. It's almost propaganda on steroids as a consequence of the internet era, but not the fundamental principles. It's still about trying to find schisms in society. What are the debates? How can states polarize existing schisms? Whether that is today around America, immigration, Trump, whether it's in the UK around Brexit or whatever, religion. It's the same fundamental principles. States doing propaganda try to work out what your pre-existing beliefs are, what your assumptions are, what your divides are in society, and then frankly smash the multitude of activities from run-of-the-mill bribery through to political funding, electoral interference, and then all the way up to coups. I think there's a danger of focusing too much on the regime change, and a lot of the academic literature is about regime change, interference, on coups, but that distorts what I think the real world of political action is all about, which is less regime change and more about the steady drip, drip, drip of subversion. It's about changing the political parameters more than the more dramatic coups and electoral interference. And again, we're seeing this out in the news recently with some big examples. China has, in Australia and New Zealand in particular, they're very, as you can imagine, hot on the threat of Chinese political action, where agents connected to the Chinese state, whether directly or make debates, shutting down protests on campus, starting protests on campus. We've seen it in the last couple of years in Canada as well, so a new number of indictments over there. And then, as I say, this morning in America, and there's another example in the UK recently as well, where somebody from supposedly linked to the Chinese state was funneling money to various British political causes. Now, this is not about regime change, and we'd be silly to think of this as a big threat of regime change. China, Russia, whoever, aren't trying necessarily to change regimes. They're trying to just subvert. They're trying to shape the political environments in their own interests. But at the same time, I think it's also really important to think about, well, what can we learn from the Cold War? Subversion is starting to come back into fashion in policy circles, in academic circles. And it's a word we haven't really thought about since the 1950s. And one of those things is being wary of over-ascribing agency to hidden hands, and assuming there's a foreign state behind everything that goes wrong in our countries, and assuming that Russia is behind everything. You know, from the British perspective, there's a tendency to think that when we voted for Brexit a few years ago, that it was the Russians that were behind it. And it's an easy scapegoat to blame Russia, whereas actually there's a lot of internal reasons and problems which led to that vote. So we need to be careful. And it's a difficult one, because I've made a career talking about covert action, talking about the importance of covert action, secret statecraft. We need to balance that with also recognising internal agency and problems, and not just blaming hidden hands left, right and centre for everything that's gone wrong. Finally, we move up to the most sensitive part of the covert operations spectrum, which ranges from, I don't know, sabotage through to training rebels, proxy wars, all the way through to assassinations and targeted killings. And again, these are not new. Probably better to say infamous form of covert action. It's the one that generates the most headlines. We see it when Nord Stream 2 pipeline, for example, in Russia, when that blew up, it's very visible, it's all over the news. When killing operations, whether it's Soleimani, Iranian nuclear scientists, so this is visible, this is prominent. But I think it's worth remembering that it forms a tiny part of covert action as secret statecraft. The vast majority is propaganda operations. It's almost like a pyramid. And they all assassination before or afterwards, for example. Or propaganda would shape the narrative to make it more conducive to a coup. And these things all exist at the same time and operate alongside open statecrafts. And I think that's an important point that intelligence scholars need to think about, including myself. When we have societies for the study of intelligence, how do we integrate that into societies for the study of foreign policy making and military, and make sure that we don't exist in a silo? And there's a danger, particularly with covert action, that we think about it as an either or, when actually it often complements open forms of foreign policy making. And it's difficult to sometimes get that across when you're writing books about covert action. Now, I've talked about propaganda, political, paramilitary, which raises the cyber question, and I get shouted at for not talking about cyber. Where does cyber come in all this? I don't talk about it partly because I understand it, but really because it's a new platform for what we've been talking about, and those same old principles still matter. And it's really interesting reading latest literature coming out from cyber scholars who really do understand the nitty-gritty of cyber, who are talking about cyber as a means of subversion, who are talking about cyber as intelligence competition you mentioned Josh Rovner earlier as someone who's spoken to you earlier in the year. He's written precisely about intelligence as cyber rather as intelligence competition. It's also sabotage. Famous operations like Stuxnet, for example, is a form of sabotage. This isn't entirely new. There's a danger, I think we're just starting to move away from it, but there has been a danger of seeing cyber as entirely new and therefore having to reinvent the wheel and forgetting literally hundreds of years of history. When what cyber has done, I mean, it obviously has changed things. It's increased the scope and the scale and the indirectness perhaps, but those fundamental principles are the same of when, how and why states use covert action. So all three of those forms of covert action, your propaganda, your political action and your paramilitary action, can take place both online and in the analog world. So if we think about covert action as secret statecraft, why is the question? Why do it? Why would a state choose to engage in this type of operation? There's four reasons get put forward. The first one is to override constraints. Those constraints will be military constraints, those constraints will be economic constraints. It is a heck of a lot cheaper to subvert a country than it is to invade a country. The stats on this are interesting. We're talking perhaps tens of millions of the CIA launching a coup in the Cold War compared to literally trillions of dollars trying to do open regime change more recently. And it overrides political constraints. The UK has a track record of turning to covert action because of this, not wanting to be accused of neo-imperial meddling, so it goes covert. Or states engage in it to prevent escalation. You're more likely to not to escalate into World War III and nuclear annihilation if you're keeping things covert, keeping things unacknowledged, which is an argument put forward by another one of your former speakers, Austin Carson, in his excellent work on covert action as signalling. He argues that when you don't acknowledge something, there's less pressure to retaliate. You keep it backstage, and therefore you're less likely to get into that escalation spiral. The third reason why states choose to use it is when they have a lack of legal exemption. This is an argument put forward by someone who hasn't spoken here, but I recommend him highly, Mike Poznansky. He says that the Americans have engaged in covert action when they lack two legal exemptions. One, they lack a decent shout of self-defense, and two, they lack a decent claim of not being invited into a conflict by a legitimate authority. If they don't have those two exemptions, then the Americans have historically tended to turn to covert action, which is a really interesting argument. It certainly holds up in the American context, but it goes back to my earlier point about the American prism, and are other countries quite as bothered about lack of legal exemption? And then finally, states engage in it to exploit that ambiguity, to sow confusion, to prod and to poke, and we've seen this with Russia, for example, to almost test NATO defences, see how far they can push by being implausibly deniable. There's a big but though. There are trade-offs. Covert action as secret statecraft is no magic bullet, and so often we see leaders of multiple countries seeing it as an easy option, thinking, I can't go to war, I can't afford politically, economically, militarily to launch an overt intervention, so let's get the spies to sort it out. The agency of covert action has often led to failure. There are three trade-offs really when you think about covert action. The more secret you want to be, the less impactful you're going to end up being. The more the less secret you want to be, then you're going to be more impactful because secrecy has a ceiling. If you want to overthrow a government and you want to do it with genuine plausible deniability, with genuinely no one knowing it was you, then you're going to then you're going to have to struggle. You're going to struggle to generate that impact, or you can outsource to a third party, but then you sacrifice control. So it's always a three-way trade-off between secrecy, impact, and control. You think about assassinations, for example. You want a high-impact outcome. Take the assassination of Soleimani by the Americans. You sacrifice secrecy for that. Reports around the killing of the Iranian nuclear scientist a couple of years ago, because according to news reports, and I quote, who else other than Israel could have come up with a remote-controlled semi-autonomous weapon in upmarket villas in the outskirts of Tehran? So you sacrifice, by going for high-impact outcomes, sacrifice a bit of secrecy. So there are an age of unsecrecy. In an age of Bellingcat, in an age of exposure, covert action is going to decrease. States can no longer get away with it. They're going to get found out. I think that's wrong. I think that covert action is going to actually increase. For a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's always been quite unsecret, or aspects of covert action have always been quite unsecret. Going way back to propaganda in the early Cold War. People write books about it, journalists writing stories about it, we're going to see a proliferation of propaganda narratives, for example. We're going to see more attempts at exposure because people interpret exposure through their own personal prisms. If we might expose a Russian covert action, for example, but we might not believe. Or through the pre-bottle strategy, pre-Ukraine. People just believe means that this stuff's going to keep on happening. And people can deny it and accuse each other, and it becomes a cycle of accusation in which covert action is just going to increase a bit of a myth. Which brings me to my half an hour, so I will stop there. Thank you very much, and happy to answer any questions.
Very much. So we'll take
my name is Guy, I'm from the military, and my question is as follows. How do you study covert operations? Well, by definition, the most successful covert operations aren't disclosed.
Because basically there are a bunch of stuff which has been disclosed. So it varies from country to country. So most of my research is about the history of British covert operations, and a lot has been disclosed, more than we realise. And often when you talk to former practitioners, they're quite shocked at what has been disclosed in the archives. The Americans have formally acknowledged, I think, about 50 or so covert actions, and they insist, and obviously we have to take their word for it, but the chief historian of the CIA insists that those 50 demonstrate not the entire universe, but a representative sample, including the biggest ones. I think a lot of them, the bigger ones, you can't keep secret, so they might not be formally acknowledged, but they're written about through press sources as well. But of course, we're not going to know everything, and particularly in the world of propaganda operations, I think they're the most difficult to expose. I think that there are a lot of those which we still don't know about, but there is enough there for us to draw, as academics, rigorous and robust conclusions, particularly of historical events, and particularly of the US and the UK. Now it becomes more difficult with other certain countries which have a different approach to archival releases. I'd love an archival-based history of French covert action, for example. That would be awesome. And there's one, but they're just not as open. But I think there's enough out there that gives us a decent flavour. And these things, even the successful ones, people do end up talking about them, and scholars can write about them.
I'm Rory, PhD. Thank you for your presentation. I would like to know if covert action can work against countries like North Korea, for example. Because it's cannot work with fake news propaganda. And another question, I read your previous book about the royal family and the intelligence, and there were some real examples like King George VI, before the Normandy invasion, was part of a covert action, major covert action.
He was. Thanks for reading it. Thanks for the plug. Yeah. So the King George VI example there, I think it's such a great story where you'll all be familiar with the D-Day deception operations, the double cross, and all that stuff. I don't need to explain that to this audience, but what you might not know is that George VI was personally involved in that secret, very sensitive operation, and MI5 got him on board. He loved intelligence. MI5 got him on board, and they coordinated his movements around the UK to visit different battalions and training stations, knowing that Hitler would be watching his moves, and they coordinated his movements with the fake intelligence reports, with the chicken feed, with everything else. They even sent them up to Ireland off the top of Scotland to give Hitler the impression that the UK would be invading Norway as part of Fortitude North, and he loved it. He was properly involved. So this goes right up to the top. On the question of North Korea, it's generally regarded that non-democracies are harder to target with covert action than democracies, because in democracies, obviously, we have free press to manipulate, we have free opposition to manipulate, multiple political parties to fund. So it's more difficult, and North Korea is obviously at the extreme end of non-democracies. So they would definitely be seen as a hard target. I think it would be, we have to think about what would the state be trying to achieve with this covert action. I think trying to assassinate or overthrow a leader or instigate a coup in North Korea would be incredibly difficult, because, as you say, there is no opposition there. I think it would also be difficult to manipulate the press, because there's no free press. What the scope is there to do, if a country was so inclined, would be to try and get information into the population. And we've seen numerous examples, some covert over the last decades, of propaganda balloons and airdrops and all that kind of thing. I think that would be the most fruitful way of trying to instigate some sort of political change. But then you have this really hard question, which states have grappled with for a very long time when dealing with non-democracies, which is, okay, we can get information to the people, we can give them a sense of change, a sense of momentum, but then what? If they then choose to rise up against the North Korean leader because they've been given this propaganda and they're going to end up being killed, that is counterproductive and also morally wrong. And this would never be backed up by a coup or by a military intervention. That's always been one of those difficult judgments. Going right back to against the Soviet Union, and Hungary in '56. Do the Americans give propaganda, give arms even to Hungarians, but they're not prepared to back it with force? And I think that would be a key limitation of any attempt to covertly influence North Korea.
Hi, good afternoon. On behalf of Israeli Ministry of Intelligence, I have one question regarding the unacknowledgeable operations. So from one side, of course, unacknowledgeable operation is for the side that is conducting the operation, but also to be used for the operation, for the state that is conducting the operation, to leave the area of denial also to the other side that was hit or that was badly wounded from this operation. And how do you see this in the 21st century, in the era of media and of course open sources, everything is on Twitter after 2 seconds. We don't leave. The area of denial for the side that was hit by this operation is getting much more shorter. And do you think this will affect covert operations?
Yeah. So the first part of that, I think, echoes Carsten's work around states. They want to almost collude in the fiction of secrecy. It's a phrase that he uses that I think United like to steal it. That even if something is visible and exposed, there's an incentive for both the target states and the sponsoring states to collude in the fiction of secrecy, and even in the face of exposure and visible evidence, they still say it wasn't us, and then the other side said it wasn't us. And then I think that will hold in the 21st century, because if the sponsoring state is saying it wasn't us, if the target state is saying nothing happened, then the exposure isn't going to cut through. And I think one of the core trends we're seeing is exposure is obviously very important. It's becoming an increasing part of states' responses to covert operations. But exposure itself is not enough. There's this assumption if you expose something, it's a kind of modernist idea. You expose something and the truth will be out and the truth will set you free. Now we know that the reality is much more complicated than that. You can expose something. It doesn't mean anyone's listening. It has to be followed by some sort of revelation. It has to be followed by sustained media pressure. It has to be followed by political pressure from senior politicians or leaders in order for it to gain traction to make a difference. Now, if both sides are still choosing not to do that because it politically suits them to collude in the fiction of secrecy, then I think, throw as much evidence as you like, it's not then going to be followed by revelation and not going to gain traction. So I think it will still hold up.
Thank you very much. I think we'll get up there. Forward. Thank you. I'll invite all the panelists to hear us there. I'll invite all of you here to join me. As we understand by now, studying covert action is a complicated task. First, because covert actions are, of course, shrouded by secrecy. And, of course, not all covert actions remain secret or are intended to remain as such. Moreover, researchers can overcome obstacles of secrecy in some cases through declassification. However, the problems of studying covert action are compounded by the elusiveness of this dark art, the ambiguity, the camouflage, the often intentional misunderstandings and misperceptions, and the mythology, as we just heard, surrounding it, make it much more difficult to grasp covert action, both conceptually and analytically. In sum, there's much that we do not know, and what we do know, we only think we know. So to help us muddle through this murky terrain, we put together a special panel of some of the leading experts on the topic. So Professor Rory Cormac, you all know by now, and we have with us Dr. Mindy Haas, who is an assistant professor of international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Her current research focuses on how congressional regulation can have unintended effects on the types of covert action used in U.S. foreign policy. Her other research interests include foreign policy decision-making, intelligence and secrecy, as well as international and constitutional law. Dr. Haas has published in the distinguished journal International Security and in the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. We have with us, sitting next to me, Dr. Ronen Bergman, who is senior correspondent for military and intelligence affairs for Yediot Ahronot and a contributing writer for the New York Times, writing extensively on Middle Eastern security, military and intelligence affairs. He has also published in Haaretz, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Newsweek, Der Spiegel, and other major media outlets. Dr. Bergman is the author of 6 best-selling books, most recently, Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations. And last but not least, in 2020, he published a book that chronicles some of the unit's greatest operations, and he's considered by some to be the torchbearer of the unit's legacy and history. So, thank you all for joining us. The panel will go as follows. I will present to you all one identical question, and you'll each have 2-3 minutes to respond. So the first question is, what is the importance of studying covert action and covert history? What is the contribution, as you see it, to broader areas of IR and international relations and history? And do you think that it can help us to better understand world affairs? And we'll start with you, Ronen.
Thank you for those kind words. I think the best thing I can do after that is to walk away. The Brits, knowing how to keep a secret, kept the work that was done in Bletchley Park, in Station X, at the end of the 80s. And it was only then they started slowly to release the fact that Alan Turing and his team were able to decrypt the Enigma. Now, of course, there were many researchers and studies, books, TV series, stories, essays about the Second World War before that. And all of them describe the narrative. But now we know that it was lacking because major part, something that happened in this place of Cambridge graduates, shortened the war in 1.5-2 years at least. So everything that was published about the Second World War before that lacked a significant major component of how the war happened and why did it happen in this specific way. And so, and this is just one example, of course, you cannot study history, you cannot have a true reading of national security, world events, wars, unless you understand what happened in the secret world. The secret world, especially by the way in Israel, where the intelligence community has such an impact and an imprint on everything, every major turn in Israeli history, every major decision-making process, every major shift or change had the imprints of the secret world, not necessarily for good. Sometimes the Israeli Jewish James Bond turns out to be Inspector Clouseau. But the fact remains, they had an imprint. And whatever you do in history, my teacher, mentor, and friend Christopher Andrew, the historian for British intelligence, was fighting, I think, throughout his career to try to educate people, to get them understand that this is not just something that happens in a different vacuum. This is happening, but has a direct impact on the truth and what happened and the history. The war in Ukraine would not have happened in this way if it was not the US deciding to declassify its most secret intelligence and publish what Putin is going to do and then share much of that intelligence with Ukraine. The Russians were planning to raid the Gostomel Antonov airport by Kiev and then raid the city. They were hoping to wrap up the battle in 48 hours. When I arrived there, I found it. They know the place because they have bunkers that the Soviets dug there, nuclear bunkers. And I found boxes of gas masks. If you remember the first days of the war, there was some intelligence saying that the Russians are preparing to launch a chemical or biological strike. Now this was not true. They were, because the boxes were of the Russian military police. They were ready for the triumphant parade throughout Kiev for protests where they need to use gas, and so they need to have gas masks. But the Ukrainians were waiting for them on the runway, took down the Spetsnaz helicopters before they landed. Then the Tupolev turned around and fled, and all this was stopped. But this was thanks to information coming from the US and Britain. And so, if you, last sentence, if you think that intelligence, secret world, special operations are consequential, then of course you need to study the history. Otherwise you don't know history.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for having me. I feel humbled and unfit for this panel because I'm not a real scholar. Okay, unlike all my colleagues here, I come from, as Ronen said, or as you said, from the operational side, and I do have an interest in history, but not much more than that. Okay. So I'm glad that Ronen took my time, and because he has specifics, but I think that it's important or even imperative to learn and to study the secret aspects of history as much as it is for history itself, because it is, as was said and will be said, I'm sure, a general part of it, or an integral part of learning history. And exactly as Ronen said, the secret, covert part of history shed light, always shed extra light on events, sometimes after the facts, mostly after the facts, sometimes years, sometimes decades, sometimes never. So it is important, and it's a part of, without which we'll never know the full picture of events, occurrences, and history in general.
I'd like to third thanking OFEC for inviting me here and creating this amazing panel, and I'm very excited to talk about my own work and research on covert action. As a scholar, my sort of field is foreign policy decision making, and thinking about the inputs, the outputs of that process, right? And without considering the opinions, the options that are coming from the secret world, whether it's the CIA or military who are advising decision makers, right? Whether we see sort of what options, what assessments are coming into National Security Council meetings, for example. By ignoring or not having access to sort of a large component of that, if it's still classified or sort of ignored in some way, it just sort of leaves a big part of this black box undefined, right? And, I think it's really important also that we don't just think about the behavior of these secret organizations, but also think about the ways that we understand how they're organized, the role of law in controlling them, what kind of oversight is possible or appropriate, right? And without sort of understanding how they operate, we also can't understand how to control them in the long run, right? I think it's very easy to assume that shadows is sort of uncontrollable, right? But do we need to assume that these secret organizations, the CIA, for example, is it a rogue elephant? Is it taking orders from the president, from the National Security Council, or are there ways?
First, that missing dimension needs to be integrated into those big questions. So Mindy's talking about democracy and oversight. These are questions about democracy. They're not necessarily questions about intelligence and how we discovered a committee from the 1980s that no one knew existed. It's what does this tell us about oversight, about liberal democracy? When we talk about intellectually, what does this tell us about World War II? It has to be integrated into much wider things, and it's a real danger of intelligence studies scholars just talking amongst ourselves. Second point is, I think, a really fruitful avenue of research, looking at the the target countries of these covert actions. Because hitherto it's all been about US, UK, Israel, countries doing it. But I think there's an importance of studying how has that impacted the development of target countries, particularly around, I don't know, conspiracism. And there's a reason Iran thinks that Britain is behind everything that ever happened in this country. And it's the same with Russia recently. At least someone still thinks we're powerful. I think that would help us understand the psyche and political culture of certain countries when they've been long-standing targets.
Thank you. I hope I didn't scare you with the time frame for your response, because your second question is, what, as you see it, are the primary challenges facing students of covert operations? And are there any new challenges given the changing nature of covert operations themselves? And more specifically, I would love to hear from all of you, what are your particular challenges as students of American, British, and Israeli covert operations? And we'll start with the American in the room.
Thank you very much. And I'll take the opportunity to talk to sort of the scholars and the students here about, research into covert action, right? And I think, the question I always get from reviewers, from people who read my work, right, is we don't know the universe of actions. We even sort of got a variation of that question already today. It's impossible to know the universe of all secret actions that have been taken. So what can we really say about the ones that we know, right? And again, maybe we have to trust some historians that we know the big events. We can look at other scholars like Gregory Treverton, who says, it's inevitable that some of these big operations will be disclosed at some point. So does that tell us all we need to know if we know those big, important events, right? And I think that goes back to what questions you're trying to answer with your research, right? Is knowing those big events enough? If you're studying something like regime change, maybe that is enough that you know about Allende, for example. But if you're interested in those smaller propaganda operations, maybe you do need to dig a little deeper to understand sort of the whole spectrum of what's happening there. And I think we also have to be especially creative if we want to think about quantitative research, which is very difficult in this domain, right? We have to acknowledge our inability to understand this universe and come up with creative research designs that sort of leverage the information we have available. And also, if you're missing certain types of information, how might that bias your results, right? Are we only seeing successful operations? Are we only seeing failures? What might that tell us about our theories or our answers that we're developing? And specifically talking about the US, as Rory said, perhaps we have the best access to information in the US about these types of events. But I also notice in sort of this burgeoning literature on secrecy that a lot of the same cases are being used sort of many times for different theories, right? And are those cases being over-explained? There's lots of determinants of what went into sort of Operation Cyclone, like Rory said, or the are we sort of cherry picking history, only focusing on those big cases or somewhat interesting ones? Or do less well-known cases sort of tell us something different about these theories that we're trying to develop? And lastly, I think it's worth thinking US even the most interesting if we're interested in, intel organizations, for example. Perhaps the influence of Israeli intel organizations on policy is a much more interesting story in the US, and one that is understudied.
Debates between historians and political scientists when it comes to this kind of thing. Because I'm a historian by training, hiding in a politics department. And when Mindy says about case selection and picking cases and cherry picking cases, I tell, which just happened to back up the theory being posited by an international relations scholar. And historians can get a a bit prickly about it. I think it's different types of research. You know, the whole parsimony versus whatever historians do, long confusing stories. I think it's really interesting. The challenge I was going to raise wasn't about sources. It was about the, sounds pretentious, but the essence of covert action, how we know what it is, because it's the kind of thing which doesn't exist in isolation. So it's incredibly difficult analytically to work out its start points and its finishing points. It exists alongside open sanctions, for example, or diplomatic negotiations. So how do we know where the covert actions stopped, or the impact of the covert action stopped compared to sanctions, for example? Covert action only ever, or tends to, work with existing internal forces. It finds an opposition group, it gives them money, funding, helps them launch a coup, for example. How do we separate the covert action, the hidden hand, from the internal agency of that pre-existing opposition group? How do we work out the start date and the finish dates for a particular covert action when, even with all the best sources in the world, there can be disagreements? We don't even necessarily know the motives for the covert action. So Albania, for example, 1948 US-UK operation, is one that's regularly picked up in the literature as a case study. But if you actually really get into the weeds of it, and we have all the sources on this, they never actually agreed what the end goal would actually be. It seemed to change on a weekly basis. And then it gets built into the quantitative data sets about, this is an example of failed regime change. Look at it, they didn't actually ever commit to regime change. They committed to subversion and maybe regime change if that worked. And so working out what we're talking about, I think, even is a challenge. You can have all the sources in the world, but it's the nature of it pushing history along. It makes it difficult to conceptualize analytically, and also makes it super difficult to judge impact. How do we measure the impact covert action had? Because then you get into the horrible world of counterfactuals, isolating agency, which is hard.
I think in Israel, trying to learn history of Israeli intelligence, Israeli covert actions, of course, for anyone, the main challenge is to get documents. The archives are closed. In 2008, I petitioned the Supreme Court against the archives of the defense establishment, Mossad, Shin Bet. They said that they were all opened illegally. There's no legal authorization for those institutions to have their own archive. That's one. And second, they need to, this was 2008, the early 2008. They need to send everything they have to the state archive and to start declassifying the material. Israel was already more than 50 years old. It needed to start declassifying at least the early documents. There was nothing. It did not declassify them. So we petitioned the Supreme Court, and at the end of that, the state admitted that it was doing things illegally, and then retrospectively declared all of those archives legal and prolonged the time of declassification from 50 years to 70 years. And when we exit court, I met then the chief of Mossad, the late Meir Dagan, and he said, Bergman, don't you worry, when it's 70, we will prolong that to 100. And he was wrong. When Israel was 70, they prolonged it to 90. Luckily, in Israel, veterans tend to forget in their private possession some of those documents. So we benefit in research, but of course this is not the way that it should be handled. The other thing, of course, is a challenge of how, when you have or don't have written documents, what do you do with oral testimonies? This is very important and hard. I'm not going to get into all the dilemmas, but of course, is it more reliable, less reliable? Is it allowed to use those statements that were shaped and stated again and again and again? I must say that when I collected some of those as oral testimonies, I thought the person was telling me the truth, only to be disappointed years later when getting my hand on the documents. I remember the late Prof once told me, now I'm going to tell you the real truth about this thing. And he told me something very dark with him involved. And only later, years later, when he was gone, I got the documents and I realized he told me something that was just very dark, but was hiding something much, much darker. So, no documents and what to do with oral testimonies. I think those are the two main challenges.
I fully agree. And here I personally have an advantage. I am not an historian, as I said, so I can do whatever I want. Okay, pretty much, and I don't have to rely solely on either on documents or libraries or archives or whatever they have. So in Israel, as Ronen correctly said, people talk. Most of the people who were actively or in the knew things that happened either covertly during the times, either really tend to keep or to forget that they keep documents in their private safes, and or when they achieve certain age, they think that it may be wrong if people do not know what they've done. At least hint about it. So we take advantage of that, and I think it's kind of funny to see the discrepancies and to look for truth and myth and outright lies or misconceptions, whatever the case may have been. And we thrive on that, okay? So it may not be a true historical work, but for most purposes, this will do until the 90 years gag is lifted, or will be in the dark for as long as records are kept on the wraps.
Thank you. Okay, so following up on that, in the introduction to your book, Ronen, you wrote the following daunting, somewhat crippling paragraph. The Israeli intelligence community guards its secret jealously. Its near total opacity is protected by a complex array of laws and protocols, strict military censorship, and intimidation, interrogation, and prosecution of journalists and their sources, as well as a natural solidarity and loyalty among the espionage agency's personnel. How then, it might reasonably be asked, to write a book about the most secretive organizations on Earth? So this is exactly the question that I want to refer back to you, considering again the low availability of archival sources in Israel. What would be your advice to students wishing to explore Israel's covert history, and specifically, and Ronen already touched on this point, what is your opinion on oral history, interviews, etc., and how reliable this is, and to what extent you use it? So we'll begin this time with you, Aviram, and we'll end up with Ronen to hear his secrets.
If there is an advice, talk to people. People will mostly talk to you back. They may put some restrictions or give you some restrictions, or they will look for an authorization for what they are going to say, but in light of lack of documents, and even if there were documents available, I think that talking to people who were actually part of the actions years back, and doesn't matter which side or what exactly did they do. Were they actual operatives, decision makers, or anything in between? It's imperative to talk to people and to get their views. And even if you get different views, opposite views, anything at all, you're in a way better place and position to judge and to compile something than otherwise. So yes, absolutely, talk to people, ask them to pick their brains and collect every document, photograph, anything that they have. Better take a photo of that or copy that and bring it back to them because it's important to them. But no question about it. Talk to people.
Thank you again. I think this is a really interesting question, and just thinking about the importance of triangulating information. And when I was sort of starting to write my book and thinking about how do you do this right, and building a case or a timeline using different secondary sources, using histories, using press accounts, using memoirs, right? Sort of learning as much of what's available as you can before you start sort of diving into whether that's archival documents or oral histories, right? But sort of having something in your head that you can then use these oral histories, interviews to sort of plug holes in your scenario or your case, right? And sort of acknowledging what holes exist. I think when I'm reading histories or other accounts and there are these footnotes, right, that talk about this person differs based on this account, on this scenario, right? Sometimes that points you to the most interesting part of a case, right? Why is there a discrepancy here between what people are telling you and why? And I think just the attempt to sort of get corroboration, whether that's from multiple people, from documents, from press accounts, and thinking about why might accounts differ, right? This might not just be about people want to lie, right? People have fallible memories. It may be a long time ago. People also have this sort of inherent desire to send a specific message that they did something well or honorable or important in how they behaved. And people want to portray themselves in a positive light, especially in something as controversial as covert action. So just thinking about what are the motivations for what people are telling you? Can you corroborate it? Can you sort of triangulate your sources?
I think the most useful part of your oral history is to help flesh out the archival record and to have, because we do have a skeletal archival record in the UK, but you can read it and get completely the wrong end of the stick. I'll give you an example. I was writing about British covert action in Yemen in the 1960s, and I had the documents, and I wrote it up, and I was completely wrong until I spoke to someone who was there, who said, I didn't cite this person, wasn't on the record or anything like that, but we talked about it, and I showed him the documents, and he said, no dear boy, you've got it completely wrong. And he showed me what the documents meant and how to read them properly. It's less about, for me anyway, getting revelations and big scoops from oral history, and more to help me interpret the skeletal archival record that we do have. And the reason why I personally don't tend to cite oral history in my books is, I'd love to hear Ronen's perspective on this, is the legal stuff that it opens up. I don't know what the case is like in Israel, but in the UK it's becoming an increasing worry for academics that if we end up publishing something we shouldn't have been told, we become legally liable and we can get done. And so recently, some of my books get a close legal read through by the teams to make sure that everything in it is properly declassified. So to avoid that headache, I just keep it all archival sources only.
We pass on the mic, so Oli added a question to you, and I would like to add another question, because you already touched on the importance and the trickery, this complexity of oral history, so I would like to ask a question about access, getting access to interview these.
I started writing the book that you mentioned, Rise and Kill First. I was asked by Random House, speaking of Random House, the publisher, the American publisher, in 2010, if I'm willing to write the Mossad history. I said, yeah. They asked how long will it take. I said it's going to take me a year, because I figured they have everything in my archive. I'm just going to do a little bit of few more interviews, and that's it. They said, are you sure? Like the history of Mossad, a year? I said, yeah, very, very strict with deadlines. I always know how things takes. Very, very, very keeping my promises. It will take me a year. They said, maybe we write a year and a half in the contract, so you're not in breach. I said, you can write whatever you want. It's going to take me a year. And then they wrote the year and a half, and after that, I was 6 years delayed. So very strict, right on point of the deadline. And I think one of the reasons is because working on this book taught me a lesson of humility. I thought, not that I know everything about any break-in of Mossad or any embassy, but the big stuff I know of, and I was wrong. And it was so much that I still need to learn and research, and I ended up with a list of 1,000 interviews. Some of them I had to meet a few times. And so 6 years delayed, when I delivered the book to Random House, they were desperate. They thought that we'd never see the manuscript. They said, but they saw the list of interviews, and they said, well, how come you got them to speak? None of them got permission. It was all, allegedly illegally. And
don't care.
And so, and I said, those people, after so many years, and I'm referring to them, after so many years in the twilight zone of secrecy, they want to make sure that their footprint is set up right and how they contributed to the national security of Israel. Things that are embarrassing or a shame in other countries, to kill a person, if it's done for the state in Israel, it's a source of a pride. Not a necessary evil that you should be ashamed of. And so Random House asked me, but not everybody, just you came and said, can you speak about the secret operation? People told me, I'm telling you things that I never told my wife. So I said, yeah, well, not all of them were that enthusiastic. And then sometimes you need to use a little push. And one of the things that I did was if someone was not ready to talk, and so while I did the one thing I think that makes Israelis more ballistic than anything else. So coincidentally, while speaking, I told that someone else took credit of his operation. Explosion. He said that he was in Syria. Now I'm going to tell you the whole story. And it's amazing how those people, the case officers, the people that their art is to manipulate others, when you touch that nerve, easy to open up. I just want to add a word of caution here, which is also why listening to these people, you also need to be very careful into accepting what they say, because those sometimes they recycle or just lie, or they don't know and they pretend to know, or they lie, or they following some things they said, maybe they don't remember, but much of what we hear, the history, some of the parts of the history, the known history of Israeli intelligence are based on those testimonies, which deliberately or undeliberately are not true, are not fully true. And there's a committee, an investigation committee sitting now at the IDF, looking at the one single event where more Israelis were killed in history. It's the explosion of the Israeli headquarters in Lebanon in 11 of November 1982. Now, this was covered up to be seen, to be shown as some main function in the gas cylinder at the kitchen of the building. And only now, so many years later, because of this cover-up, because everybody believed the cover-up, but not everybody, then only now they investigate. This is a very, very serious case, and there are other myths that we believe in that are just based on those oral testimonies that we need to be very careful with.
Thank you very much. So we'll now move on to the last question, and this will be a lightning round where I will ask each of you to tell us what was your most exciting discovery. So since you already have the mic, let's start with you.
I cannot tell you about the most exciting because it works now. But hopefully, if one day I'm able to publish, then maybe you remember this. But one moment of the Recess for Rising King First, I do remember. This was 2012. I was sitting with former high-rank general of the Air Force, decorated pilot. We were speaking about all things about assassination, targeted killing, fighting terrorism, and then he said, "Ronen, you know, I like you. Then I'm now going to tell you the most secretive event in the history of the Israeli Air Force." And I said, "But you need to promise me one thing first." I said, "Yeah, whatever." And I said that after I finish, you go to that other general of the Air Force, and only if he is willing to tell you the story on the record, then you publish. If he doesn't, then you forget all about that. And then he tells me the story about how Ariel Sharon ordered the Air Force to take down a commercial airline with Yasser Arafat on board. So ordering Israeli Air Force to kill hundreds of civilians in order to kill Yasser Arafat, do that above blue water so nobody would find the wreckage. And then how the Supreme Command of the Air Force rebelled against the Israeli Ministry of Defense, this is late 1982, making sure that Israel would not be stained by this moral war crime forever. And so I was just thinking of writing the chapter in my head, and he said, "But remember what you promised." I said, "But how can I convince that other officer? It's like the Habsburgian, like old school, he hates journalists, he hates me, how can I convince him?" He said, "I don't care, you promised." So I went to see that other officer, long story short, and I started, and he's very, very strict general. He had a huge office overlooking Tel Aviv, and I started to ask him all sorts of questions, just going in circles. And at a certain point he said, "Ronen, why did you come? What do you want?" So I said, this is the story I came. And then his gaze suddenly changed, softened. He said, this is 2012, he said, "You know, for 30 years I've been waiting for someone to come and ask me this question. Wait here." He stood up, he walked to the other side of the room, he moved the chair, he moved a painting. Behind that was a safe. He opened the safe and he took out the log of that operation. The chapter 15 in my book has this story, which was also after that a cover for the New York Times Magazine, and it has all the tail number of that airplane where Arafat was supposed to be, etc. And it comes from the fact that he was holding that. He said, "I was waiting for you to come." And this was, if there's one moment, this is the moment I choose.
Great moment. We're all
I was working with a colleague of mine on a documentary about Uri Ilan, a member of a 5-soldier team that went into Syria in the early 50s to replace listening device. They were captured and were held hostages in a Syrian jail. Okay, Ilan committed suicide after 5 weeks because he was afraid he would not hold up in future interrogation, and he thought he would better off commit suicide than reveal his secrets. Okay. So we went to the UN archives in New York City, looking for the ceasefire committee records to see what was after the fact, to look for materials that can be part of the documentary. And out of the folder, there was a very small envelope, like really in the stories, out of which popped out few black and white photographs that were taken by the Syrians, showing Ilan right after they released him from the news. He made out of sheep. Okay, there were about 7 or 8 photos showing his body, blah blah blah, very graphic and not pleasant to show. And we were kind of appalled and bewildered. So we photographed the copies and we kept them, and we did not put them in the documentary.
Trying to be.
Yeah, I mean, Ofek, you could have led with me. You know, maybe ended with Ronen. Mine is certainly not going to be as exciting, but one story, you know, from my time in the archives was, I think it's just amazing to see sort of actual writing of leaders, right? Like, I get to see a memo and see Henry Kissinger's notes on it and what his thoughts were. Like, that's pretty cool. You know, it makes you sit back and think about it. But I was writing a chapter of my book that has to do with the Angolan Civil War and the U.S. providing money and weapons to groups in the Angolan Civil War. So I was looking through documents from the State Department from the 1970s. And I was looking through the documents of this one person, Joe Sisko, the Assistant Secretary for Political Affairs in the Department of State.
We remember him.
Yes. And in there was this red piece of paper, and I was like, ooh, this probably is good if it's bright red, right? And it was this memo that he had received from the DoD entitled Departure of a Nuclear Submarine for Angola. And in that document, the submarine was given instructions to send recognition signals to a Soviet missile destroyer that was also in the vicinity. And that this signal that was being contemplated was explicit. And even though the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time opposed doing this, that he was overruled, and they still decided to sort of send the nuclear sub with these orders, right? And I mean, at the time, I was sort of seeing it as this, you know, political funding operation, especially in the 1970s, right? And then seeing the scope of this into the sort of the larger nuclear Cold War context really brought home, you know, that this is touching on broad matters of statecraft, of national security, and not just sort of little political funding operation in Africa, right? So yeah, just cool to see the context of these operations in the greater scope of things.
My favourite one was from writing this book about the relationship between the British royal family and British intelligence services. And we talked a bit about sources. The royal family have no sources. There's nothing. Everything is classified. They are incredibly difficult to write about. They don't talk either. I can rock up for an interview with the Queen. So the actual intelligence side of that book was pretty easy compared to the royal side. But I was reading some manuscripts at Birmingham University Library, and it was the diary, the unpublished version of a diary. The published version's out, it's quite dull, but it was this guy's unpublished version, and he was the head of the Foreign Office's Middle East
Middle East desk in the mid-1950s. And he was at the palace. He's writing about how he was at the palace, having his afternoon catch up with the Queen. They were talking about the Middle East, they were talking about Jordan, they were talking about the uncle of the King of Jordan, who had been saying some nasty things about the British, and they were talking about propaganda operations to try and throw him off the scent, if you like. And this diplomat is chatting away to the Queen. The Queen looks at him in the eye and says, "Has nobody thought of slipping something in his coffee?" I read that, and that was a jaw-dropping moment, given the just utter secrecy of the palace, and that unsurprisingly was cut from the published version of this guy's memoirs.
Okay, thank you all very much. These were all. This concludes my questions. So now we'll open it up to some questions from the audience. We'll have a few minutes for that. And wrap it up. Don't be shy.
I'll have a question. Most of what you do is in search of the truth and to unveil secrets from the past. Do you feel as some sort of a mission of explaining or bettering the way intelligence organizations do these clandestine activities, these covert activities, or is it just a byproduct if anybody reads your books?
I think that there are two byproducts here. First of all, I always say that I believe that the real world of intelligence is totally different than what we see in movies or TV series. I mean, it's not less interesting or more interesting, I think it's more interesting, but anyway, it's just totally different. And to explain that world, but also situate that in the overall context. Because those operations do not happen in void, they happen for a reason in that specific time, ordered by those specific people and executed by those operatives. And to do that, not just to write about a series of operations, fascinating as they are, but explain the context. And also, and not less important, is that, at least for the Israeli case, I think that the Israeli intelligence community, which is the biggest per capita in the Western world, and second in total number, true number, second only to the US in its size, and I think number one in its consequential impact on what is happening in Israel and the Middle East, and sometimes the world, but in I would say, opposite ratio. The constitutional, legal, political, parliamentarian oversight mechanisms are very weak. And I think that it is our duty, no right, but duty, our obligation, our oath, as historians, as journalists, I also work for this local paper in Brooklyn, to be those ones and feel the gap, the void, and make sure, this is the byproduct, we need to just tell the truth, but the byproduct is that we make sure that the spies, the spooks, the operatives do not cross the line in doing something that is undemocratic when they serve democracy. And this line is can be very evasive, tricky, thin. We need to make them sure, because one thing I always, not always, but in many, many cases I saw that when you give intelligence agencies authority, they will always took the full extent and then exceeded a little bit.
Just picking up on that oversight point, one of the things I'm interested in is congressional oversight and sort of the reforms of the U.S. intelligence community, right, that happened after the 1975 Year of Intelligence, right, when the Church Committee helped the CIA sort of reckon with all these crazy things it had done in the 60s and 70s, including some of the Castro operations like Rory had mentioned earlier. But I think it's really important for us to ask, you know, there were these laws passed, attempt to restructure, to constrain what the intelligence community could do. Did those work? Did they work in a productive way? Was it simply, you know, red tape on the intelligence community, or did it sort of channel the effectiveness, the authorization in a more democratic way? And today we can see a similar debate going on with Section 702 of the FISA Act that authorized mass collection, right? And question whether that should be reauthorized or not. And that's a tool that the intelligence community relies heavily on, is very much in favor of, but again, was sort of challenged as very much undemocratic. What way should our law cut to sort of enable that activity, to not enable it, and sort of only by opening up and understanding the activities of intelligence agencies can we really have the appropriate debate for the scope of it.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It was very interesting. I would like to know, do you see differences between men and women when it comes to integrating covert action by the way they answer you, or if they more open to say two things, less open?
Women are smart.
I didn't see any difference in. I did not see or experience any differences between male or female interviews. I try to kind of remember while you were asking the question, and I don't think there were differences in the way they took action. Maybe they considered things or did either operative side or decision-making side or case officering side. But as far as the interaction with me, there was no difference whatsoever.
Same. And I haven't done enough interviews to give a universe of, how would you say, as a quantitative scholar?
Yeah, universe.
A universe of data.
Thank you.
When the public learns about covert action, how do we make the public more knowledgeable and able to perhaps know the effects of propaganda in contrast to making the public more paranoid? So how we make that conversation and difference when we learn and write and talk about the subject?
It's a great question. I think it's a really, really important one. And it comes down to how we as academics and how journalists report on covert action and how they, when they do their exposure. I think there's a real risk of when an operation gets exposed, it gets talked up as being sensational, as being impactful, when quite a lot, retrospectively looking back at some of the Russian operations, they were a bit rubbish. Some of their propaganda operations were a bit blunt, and they might have reached a lot of people, but didn't necessarily have a lot of impact. And yet you see a headline, and sometimes academic articles, because we have to get clicks as well, which will say something like, Russia trying to overthrow Trump, or no, they wouldn't do that. Russia successfully installing Trump, or whatever it might be. And I think when we engage with the public on this, we need to expose it and talk about it, but also talk about the limitations of it, and not necessarily equate, I don't know, scope and scale with impact. There was some stories recently about, I think it was in The Guardian back home, about a data firm who were messing around in elections. And the headline were, private data firm rigging elections. That was the headline. And you actually read the article and read it down, and they weren't rigging elections. So it's about exposing, but in a nuanced way, which doesn't mean it's got to be boring, but in a nuanced way, which also highlights the limitations. Unfortunately, it often works against the drive for engagement and clicks, and we get, just like, New York Times requires X number of clicks for funding models, we as academics also get done on our citations, so we're guilty of it as well.
Yeah, thank you for this question. In our post-truth world, I guess, right? And I think what I talk to my students about anyway is about like media literacy, right? That anybody is going to inherently sort of push back against you telling them what to believe, the substance of what is true or what to believe, right? But I feel like our only hope here is to teach people how to read more effectively and think about, how do you judge a source? How do you tell if this is some sketchy Facebook thing? How do you go back and attribute the bias of a certain publication, right? And I think that only through sort of learning some of those skills and making them habitual can we make citizens, good consumers of media, and maybe paranoid for the right reasons.
Okay, so please, one last question.
What do you think are the main similarities or differences in covert action between the US, Britain, and Israel?
I think there are lots. I think the main similarities across lots of states are leaders turning to this type of statecraft when they feel constrained to get something done overtly. I think there are similarities in the limitations of what can be achieved by these countries. I think it's very difficult to launch coups and to instigate regime change, but where I think there is similarity is more kind of embedding some of this stuff into wider forms of statecraft. So it's a lower level, way below regime change, just gradually trying to kind of shape, trying to disrupt. I think a lot of covert action, whether lesser understanding of here than other people in this room, obviously, but it's about trying to disrupt the adversary, the opposition, the enemy. It's not trying to necessarily totally eliminate a regime. It's making life difficult for that regime. And I think that is a constant across loads of covert actions, across lots of different states. It's increasingly about disruption, making life hard in an unacknowledged manner.
The only thing I would add to Rory's excellent answer is also thinking about the utility of ambiguity and denial, right? Why would states be interested in the ability to deny a certain activity? What would prevent them from using overt military activity or using special forces to accomplish something different? And thinking about those sources, the reasons for that deniability, and sort of that can be traced across countries, the usefulness of that deniability.
Okay, so please join me in thanking our panelists for a great. This concludes the concluding event of a great first year for the Israeli Forum for Intelligence Studies. So I'd like to thank again our panelists and you for coming in this disruptive day And just a quick word for IFIS members amongst us. You've just received an email with a feedback on the year, looking back. So we would really appreciate if you take a few minutes to fill that. So thank you very much again, and we'll see you next year.